Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you got to learn a little bit more about our visiting chapter or the chapter that you got to meet today. If you all didn't get the chance to and would like to keep in touch with each other, I encourage that you drop your social media in the chat if you feel comfortable with it, so that we could give each other a follow and get to know each other a little bit more. So I just invite you to do that if you would like. But I guess for now we can move on. So internal, and just go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Irij, and I'm one of the co-directors of GHU at Loyola.
And I'm Sarah, and I'm also the co-director of GHU, and we're roommates, so we're not breaking any rules by being together.
Just thought we'd put that out there to preface. So yeah, as per our sequence of events, we're going to start talking about migrant reform and education policies. And the way that the GHU co-directors decided to break this conversation down is talk about migrant reform and education, not only in Cincinnati and Chicago, but also in Thailand, seeing that Cincinnati has a global partner. So we're really excited to get this conversation going. All right, so starting with Chicago, what I decided to do is break down the conversation into national and local to kind of get a holistic perspective of the situation in Chicago. So starting with national, this article that I referred to came out this past Friday, and it was from ABC 7 News Chicago, entitled "The House Passes Immigration Bills for Farm Workers and Dreamers." So to kind of give you guys a synopsis of the article, Democrats basically won the first of this year's vote on an issue that has been facing an uphill climb in the Senate on a nearly, it was a fairly tight vote with 228 to 197 votes this past Thursday. Lawmakers approved one bill that was offering legal status to about 2 million dreamers in the country. And they also had a second component of the bill that was also voted in at a 247 to 174 vote for a second measure, creating similar protections for about 1 million farmers who are in the United States. Seeing that the government estimates that these numbers comprise about half of the nation's agricultural workforce. In a statement after these votes, the president came up to say that these actions are a critical first step towards a more sweeping overall, as he proposed in terms of immigration in his administration. He said that he wants to work with Congress towards building a 21st century immigration system that is grounded in dignity, safety, and fairness for all. And he hopes that these are the first steps towards long-term solutions in America's immigration system. Transitioning a little bit into what this means for us locally here in Chicago. One of the articles that I referred to was Chicago's WG9, where Lori Lightfoot signed a welcoming city ordinance, which was intended to add protections for immigrants in Chicago. So Lori Lightfoot is one of our mayors here in Chicago, and not only her, but past mayors have also described Chicago as a sanctuary city for immigrants in the past. And in order to uphold this, the mayor brought forward what is known as the Welcoming City Ordinance. These amendments are intended to take legal protections a step further for protections for due process of Chicago's immigrants. According to an individual's lawyers, Jesus Lopez was deprived of due process at a traffic stop, and this led to him being detained by police in Chicago, who transferred him to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and unfortunately he was later deported. Based on this, our mayor here in Chicago signed the Welcoming City Ordinance in on Tuesday. She says, with a stroke of the pen, your rights will be at long last protected, is her intention behind this plan. And the ordinance itself forbids police from arresting a person based solely on their immigration status. It's intended to block police from providing support for federal immigration enforcement operations and kind of take away city agencies' ability to maintain or share people's immigration status when it's not intended to be. And these changes are coming into act in our city after a couple of years of controversy behind ICE and their raids across the country. In Chicago, the Trump administration's policies on immigration were criticized by various human rights groups across the country. And Chicago definitely saw the back end of these enforcements because they affect people in our city directly. There was a zero tolerance enforcement at the border that was brought forward by the Trump administration, and it caused a lot of children to be separated from their parents at the border. So these acts that are being brought forward by the mayor are thought to hopefully result in undocumented individuals being less fearful to provide information to the police in the city here in Chicago. And then lastly, another article that I looked at was from WTTW Chicago entitled Southern US Border Sees Surge in Migrant Children's Crossing Over. Seeing that we have had an increased number of unoccupied migrant children that are being brought to Chicago, various agencies hold these children in what are described as warehouse-like detention facilities. I'm sorry, I got there eventually. Yes, okay. So the Biden administration is only allowing unaccompanied immigrant children into the country, but they continue to uphold what is known as Title 42, which bars other asylum seekers, including these children's parents, from entering the country with them. And this issue hits close to home because our school, so Loyola is a couple of miles out from downtown. We're in a city called Rogers Park, and there's 5 Chicago centers, such as the ones that are being described, that are upheld by the Heartland Human Care Services organization, and 2 of the 5 are in Rogers Park. So I'm sure any Loyola student can attest to this. In the past year, there were a couple of protests against the Heartland Society that Loyola students alike participated in, and the protests took place on our college campus themselves. So I wanted to give you guys kind of a overall kind of view of migrant reform within the city, not only locally, but also in a national perspective. So sorry to ramble on quite a bit, but yeah, that's our end. And then we can go ahead and transition into Cincinnati.
Unfortunately, Cincinnati is a little bit similar-ish to what was spoken about Chicago, so we decided to only do the international part. My name is Anish Sharma. I am one of the internal coordinators at the University of Cincinnati. And our partner is SAW, and they work very actively on the Thailand-Burma border. So we thought it would be interesting to just talk about some of the immigration policies that are prevalent in that area. So just for context, there was conflict within Burma started in 1949 when the Karenni people called for equality in 1949. But this was worsened when there was a military coup and a dictator by the name of Ne Win came in power. And he essentially enforced policies against ethnic opposition groups, which led to a lot of the war-torn conditions that we see today in Burma. And as a result of that war, lots of Karenni refugees were forced to flee into Thailand at the border. So regarding the immigration policies, though, Thailand has been very conservative with their immigration regulation. It was found that in 2004, the Thai government had pressured non-government organizations and the UN itself to stop screening prospective asylum seekers coming from Burma to Thailand. And it actually took an entire month to gain approval to resume immigration. So for a whole month, asylum seekers were denied immigration into Thailand. Also, there have been calls for the removal of segregation of Burmese immigrants to the border. Currently, Thailand is claiming that they are harmonizing Burmese refugees by putting them all in the same place, but it creates this notion of separate but equal, which is not fair. And it also works well for Thailand because they don't want the pro-democracy Burmese immigrants to kind of influence the Thailand's general public. There's also been proven that they have regular deportation of Burmese migrants each month. And something that's interesting is that they prioritize the illegal residency status over asylum seeking. So once the Burmese migrants are forced out of Thailand, they're just stuck there. They can't come back in, which is quite cruel. From there, we're going to transition into kind of education policies regarding Chicago. Yeah.
Yeah, so in regards to education policies in Chicago, primarily the conversation is going to consist of the Chicago Public Schools, or CPS. So just a couple of brief stats. There's approximately 350,000 students who are enrolled from the school year 2019 to 2020 in CPS schools. This consists of approximately 642 schools, including district-run, charter, contract, and safe schools within the Chicagoland area. So that keep that in mind whenever we're talking about the articles later on. So the Chicago Sun-Times released an article entitled "More than 6 in 10 CPS kids, including most students of color, won't be in schools when in-person learning resumes." I decided to kind of frame the conversation with regards to the COVID pandemic and what that means for education policies in the city. So nearly 80,000 Chicago public schools students planned on returning to classrooms once schools were reopening. This accounts for about 40% of K through 8 preschool and extracurricular education cluster programs who initially were going to be eligible for in-person learning, according to data released by the district, I think 2 Wednesdays ago. And this matches a trend seen in other large urban school systems that have already resumed some in-person instruction. The trends that they're seeing across the country, predominantly in these big cities, are that there's a disproportionate number of those Chicago public school families that are opting to send their children back to school. Majority of these families consisted of white households, while families of color were more likely to decline the opportunity to return in person, as the CPS data shows. And this reality raises a question about arguments that have been made by Mayor Lightfoot and CPS officials that reopening schools would help to reduce racial inequity gaps caused by remote learning, a belief that is being upheld at various Board of Education meetings. So it's a very interesting conversation to kind of bring in as we transition to being in this pandemic for over a year and what kind of implications those would mean for society moving forward. And with that, we can transition into education policies in Cincinnati.
All right. Funny enough, our public school system is also CPS, Cincinnati Public School System. And even though it kind of identifies as one large body of schools in Cincinnati's counties, there's a kind of discrepancy or diversity among like the students' backgrounds and the schools' backgrounds themselves. Just as an example, I provided Ethel M. Taylor Academy, essentially kind of like a elementary school. But most of the students that go there, their average English and math scores are below the passing rate. When a majority of students come from households below the poverty line. And the school kind of acts to provide like major meals for students. And it's partnered with our university, specifically a club named Bearcat Buddies for tutoring aid. So some inclusive policies that I found on the CPS's website that I thought were interesting, 2 of them specifically. One is students experiencing homelessness. In the next couple slides, we're going to be talking about child poverty, so I won't get into this too much. But Hamilton County, which is a county near us, in 2018, 24.8% of children were living in poverty. And so this policy kind of enforces the inclusion of children who are homeless. And I think that that can be seen as a formality to just put it in the rule book. But this type of policy really makes a difference in places where like child poverty and homelessness is really prevalent. There's also an anti-racism policy that was approved on December 16, 2020. I'm uncertain as to why it took so long to kind of implement that, but my hope is that it will further the elimination of racism in schools by having, review of curriculum that can be seen as discriminatory or just racist in general. Yeah. And from there, we can transition into the education system on the Thailand border. So the Thailand border consists of primary school. So that would be like elementary school, middle school, and high school. Unfortunately, there are no universities in the Karenni camp. And as we'll see like later in the slide, it serves as a limitation for refugees who are trying to pursue higher education. Curriculum is community-based. So if there are any like Karenni cultural holidays, those are celebrated as opposed to national or international holidays. Something interesting is that all activities or review for education systems have to be, or in Thai refugee camps, need to be approved or sanctioned by the Royal Thai government. Below there are just a bunch of ministries and national bodies that need to be consulted before making the changes. But there's a lot of limitations that are unspoken about for refugees pursuing higher education. Interesting thing is that the students who are born there are considered stateless, and most of the colleges will require some form of travel documents. So that is a severe limitation for refugees pursuing higher education. Also, internet access is very restricted or not as strong as it needs to be. So it makes studying for standardized tests harder, like the TOEFL. And also the TOEFL is an online exam. So without internet access, you can't physically take it. There's also lack of finances and scholarships provided by the Thailand country. And then teacher retention is very low because teachers will just kind of come inside the camps, work there a little bit, and then eventually move on to other career opportunities. There's also lack of training and experience among the teachers, so it does make it hard to create educational institutions that are robust. And then finally, there are foreign teachers that come to these camps who do not speak Karenni languages, and that can act as a barrier for students who are trying to pursue higher education.
All right, so with all of this information about our cities and their education policies and migrant reform in mind, we're going to transition into one of our first breakout rooms. So I think Jonathan just went ahead and pasted a Google document with all of the discussion questions that we're going to be referencing throughout the presentation. Before we kind of break out, I'd like to remind you guys that the breakout discussion questions are just kind of a general outline if you guys don't know where to take the conversation, but feel free to kind of digress and talk about anything that you've been inspired to talk about. Feel free to kind of offer your insight about your experiences and your partnership within your chapter whenever we talk about these various questions. But yeah, I hope you guys have a good conversation.